And welcome to Libertarian Counterpoint. I am your host, James Just. With me is my co-host and author, Mr. John Cameron. John, the IRS won big last night. Yeah, it's the Powerball hit.
How big did they win?
The IRS won $600 million.
600 million.
Well, because allegedly the person who won the Powerball won $1.2 million, but of course $1.2 billion. But of course, by the time the tax man is done, you're getting less than half of that. So, yeah.
Well, and I'm sure that every penny of that will be used efficiently and judiciously and watched like a hawk by the government. So if I was that person, I'd be happy to. I can't even say that with a straight face.
I just want my potholes to get fixed, John. That's really all I want.
Not going to happen, bro.
No. It's not going to happen in New York either. New York City has decided to implement congestion prices and into Manhattan.
A tax. Yeah.
Yeah, a tax to drive into Manhattan.
Yeah.
Of course.
$27.
$27 a trip. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, is this not just an attack on the freedom of movement of the poor? Because now, if you're poor, you can't go to Manhattan. How can you drive into Manhattan? You're going to have to walk or take a bus,
or take the subway.
Take the subway.
And the problem is their ridership's been dropping in the subway pretty terrifically, and so. Well, I think also they want to penalize all the Uber drivers, and I'm sure if you look at it somewhere in there, it will have a deal for the taxi cab businesses and punishment for Uber and Lyft, because used to be a cab medallion in New York City's worth $250,000. Now it's worth a bucket of spit. So. There's some hidden stuff in there, and it's crazy. It's like California adding a wealth tax on the millionaires that keep all these crazy California programs, and New York's doing the same thing to itself. They're pursuing people for crimes of hate that aren't hate. They're just stating biological facts, and letting people get away with property crimes. They're not even pursuing things, the police, to keep people safe, but they're going to do this. I mean, it's basically like a cold, tall version of California.
Yeah, and it's crazy, the fact that nobody of these people who allegedly care about the poor sit there and talk about, okay, how are poor people going to deal with this? If you need to go to visit somebody in Manhattan, but you've got, I don't know, to carry something rather large or cumbersome, and you have to supposed to take that on the subway now, right? It's like,
well, but some things you can't take on the subway.
Yeah. So what if you wanted, you want to strap a mattress to your roof and drive it across town?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't do that now because of congestion charging.
So what you're going to have to do is strap the mattress on your car and then pick up some riders to go along and charge them, and then you'll run afoul of some law. And it's ridiculous. It's people as a libertarian, I hate to say there should be rules, but in this case, I think there does need to be another amendment to the Constitution. That's that nobody works in government unless they run a private business that's shown a profit. And if they can't do that, if they haven't created wealth to hire at least one person, or let's say they're solopreneur, and they've been able to manage bottom line and provide a product or service that drove enough income more than expenses that they showed a profit, they should never be in a position to spend taxpayers' money because they have no concept. None.
Well, this is
zero.
The problem. This is the problem when we have activists running things. It's because they don't actually think about or even know about all the things that intersections the policy that they want. Right? They want this congestion. They want allegedly congestion taxing, so that reduces climate change, right? Yeah. Which isn't going to happen because China's not on board. So as long as China's not on board,
did we put that on the list that China's not on board? We did. It's down there.
Yeah, it's down here. So you've got China. So no matter what we do, we're just hurting the poor people. We're just hurting poor people, and we're deliberately hurting poor people, and we're pretending that we're not. And that's really kind of the annoying thing. Is these are the people who allegedly claim to care about the poor the most, and they are the ones who are hurting the poor the most. And it's repeated, and it's over and over again. And frankly, I'm getting tired tired of talking about it sometimes, but someone's got to.
Well, you're going to have to stay tired because it's not going to change. The people who make a show of wanting to help the least fortunate, whether it's a demographic or an age group or people from a country or a state or whatever, or the people who use those people as pawns to get elected and keep power. And it's going to keep happening.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Until we throw all the bums out.
Yeah, and we fight this through free speech. One of the things we get to do here is we get to speak freely, and we get to talk about these things, and we're going to continue. But our friends, Mr. Fields, has a...
Richard Fields?
Richard Fields.
We have a piece from Richard Fields?
Mr. Richard Fields will be here to join us here from the field, talking about free speech. So let's see what Richard's got to say today.
No, we'll look at the big screen over here. Tell me if there's a different one over there. Oh, yeah.
No?
Free speech is valued more by those without power than those who have power. One of the advantages of being alive for a long time and studying history is observing politicians change their rhetoric to suit their short-term objectives. I grew up in the 1950s, the McCarthy era. Joe McCarthy, a loudmouth, rabble-rousing Republican senator from Wisconsin, rose to fame by loudly proclaiming that the State Department and other branches of the administrative state were infested with Russian-influenced communist sympathizers. Right-wing Republicans took him seriously. Democrats joked that McCarthyites were finding commies under every bed. Social conservatives controlled the media, print, movies, and TV. Nudity on screen was verboten. Heck, Laura and Rob in the Dick Van Dyke Show and Desi and Lucy in I Love Lucy slept in twin beds. Birth control, other than abstinence from engaging in sex, was actually illegal. Liberals advocated for more freedom. The American Civil Liberties Union went to court to increase civil liberties. The First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of assembly right for Nazis to march in a Jewish neighborhood in Skokie, Illinois, was a case won by the ACLU. The free speech movement in Berkeley was a massive, months-long protest against the Vietnam War, demanding an end to restrictions on free speech in protest of the war and other issues. The Cold War and the origins of the Vietnam War were actually conservative, the existential struggle of the capitalistic West against communism. The Clinton Wars in the 90s in the former Yugoslavia were essentially wag the dog wars to distract people from paying as much attention to the Clinton sex scandals, but they made war more of a bipartisan endeavor. The Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Obama wars in the Middle East were all allowed to happen with support from both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats no longer welcomed anti-war activists. On war, the parties are now unified. In the 50s and 60s, social conservatives controlled the media and were the biggest influence on culture. Liberals were the advocates for free speech. During the Trump years, Democrats, grasping at straws to counter Trump's effective brand of populism, seized on accusing him of being in bed with the Russians, McCarthyism with party roles reversed. Now Republicans could joke that Democrats were finding a Russian under every bed. Now that we have a de facto war on Ukraine, or in Ukraine, against Russia that started during the Democratic Biden presidency, the primary anti-war voices are mostly Republican. In the vacuum of cultural ideals resulting from revulsion to the Vietnam War, the left saw an opportunity and took it. They, over a period of years, gained near complete control of academia and the media. Now that they are in control of the culture, they have become the opponents of free speech. Conservatives have become free speech champions. Only libertarians and classical liberals have been consistently free speech during both eras. We will continue.
Well done, Richard. Well done.
It's a the importance of free speech can actually not be understated. It's just not possible to understate it. Because it's not just the person speaking, it's the person hearing whose rights you're violating. You have the right to hear something if you choose to. And you know, you may want to hear it so you can disagree with it. You know, what is it? You want to know what your enemies are thinking, so you want to be able to hear what they're doing.
That's why I read the New York Times right there.
So yeah, it's, you know, it's a strange thing. A couple weeks ago, John, we talked about how a judge had said the Biden administration and, well, the government more in general couldn't talk to social media companies about censorship and whatnot. We've had just the other day, an appeals court has stayed that order until we can have another
look at it.
another
Take
look at
it. Yeah.
And the perspective here is strange, right? The government, the court, at least in this case, the appeals court, has decided to take the government's stance as that it's important rather than the stance that the individual right is more important than the right of the government. That's what I'm trying to say. They've sided on the side of the government rather than the side of the individual.
Which they do a lot.
Which they do a lot. And the question is, it's no surprise, right? Because where do they get their checks from? You know, I mean, even if it's not a conscious thing, the government writes their checks, you're going to have a little bit more perspective. Your perspective is going to lean a little bit more towards that, is it not?
Yeah, no. And it's when judges find against the government, I'm always kind of shocked because most judges, very few judges come from, most of them were lawyers, an awful lot of them were DAs or assistant DAs, and very few of them were public defenders, very few of them were criminal trial lawyers. As a matter of fact, you know, if you're a lawyer on the other side, it's really hard to get a judgeship because you don't have experience with the machinations of, whatever. Richard will tell me how I mispronounce that word, of the government. So there's a bias toward the government in everything in this country. And since we are a country that started off hating the government, I don't understand how that happened. I mean, if you get out a student loan and you work for a nonprofit or a government agency for 10 years, then your student loan is forgiven. Until they get rid of Chevron deference, which I think they will, if you go into a courtroom, the government defers to the opinion and expert opinion of government witnesses over private witnesses about scientific expertise and everything else. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, and our Constitution is set up to actually deliberately set it up to be the opposite. We're deliberately set up to actually be the opposite, where the rights of the individual are supposed to be
favored, and the government. Well, in criminal cases, the government has to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the person is guilty of robbery, or murder, or fraud, or all these other things that people are guilty of. But now only 3% of criminal cases, I think, go to jury trials. 97% of them are plea bargain, and they're basically extorted in accepting sentences rather than run the risk of the government ganging up on them in court and piling on all these charges. So everything in this country, when it comes to the protection of the individual right against the government, the oppressor, you know, that we threw off when we kicked the English out, has been flipped upside down. Yeah, upside down.
And this has made some strange consequences. It's had some strange consequences. There are groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which used to be an honorable activist group, right?
So was the ACLU.
They used to be honorable activists, but now they're just, in order to get their government funding, they've essentially become everything's hate now. Anything that the right people will disagree with is now going to be labeled as hate, even if it's just disagreement. Disagreement is now defined as hate.
Anybody on the left doesn't commit hate speech. Anybody on the right does commit hate speech. They pay lots of their employees $400,000 or more a year. When the Southern Poverty Law Center started out, it was a good, basically they were representing poor people in the South. Southern Poverty Law Center, right? So now, and they said as soon as they got $50 million, they would stop fundraising. Well, and then they said as soon as they get $100 million, they'd stop fundraising. And then now they have almost $1 billion in their in their accounts. They're still fundraising. So, and basically, I think just become, like the ACLU, a tool of the left. And whatever they say, if anybody on the right says something, it's hate speech. If anybody on the left says something, it's not hate speech. I mean, the members of the squad in Congress who are Muslims can talk about the fact that the elimination of the Jewish state of Israel would be a good thing, and apparently that's not hate speech. They can say that their words were misunderstood, but if JFK, who I think is a nut, by the way, he's got to make some good points about things, but I still think he's a nut, says that there are some biological or demographic tendencies in COVID that make certain groups and races more susceptible to becoming very ill from it, then that's hate speech. But it's actually based upon studies that certain races and demographic groups were less affected and some were more affected. So it's crazy. There's a huge double standard. When you come to libertarians, there's a triple standard, because everybody thinks libertarians are crazy, and we're not. We're the only people that. I almost bought this T-shirt just to bring it in, and on the one side it says it's got like a line down the middle, and a T here, and I wish I had a pencil, I'd draw it. And over here it puts experts, and there's no tick marks in experts. And over here on this side it says conspiracy theories, and there's about 33 tick marks, because the experts have been wrong every single time, and the conspiracy theorists have been right.
Well, that's the thing. We've gone back. We've talked about how in next week's show how things we predicted happen. But they happen 10 years later because it takes that long for the consequences to show up, and then everybody forgets that you predicted it.
Well, it takes that long for government hiding it to stop working.
Yeah, that's probably
like the Biden stuff that he bragged about on the floor of Congress, that he convinced them to fire the prosecutor that was going after his son in the Ukraine, where we're now fighting a war where he was instrumental in throwing over the duly elected government, which was still a crap government, and threatened to withhold money that we'd already earmarked and said was okay for the Ukrainian government to have. Now that's coming to light, and we've been talking about that for how long? On this show, 10 years, probably.
Yeah, it's for at least 5, right?
Yeah. Well, no, how long ago? 2015. It wasn't 10 years, so it was in 2015. So we've been talking about it for 8 years. Yeah. Right after it happened, we're talking about it. So
these kind of things are nothing new for us, and we've got to figure.
You heard it here first, folks.
you just heard it 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court. This one, John, I actually couldn't read. So this you're going to have to kind of put this one. Supreme Court decisions and the public perception of them.
I should do on these because it's behind the paywall in the New York Times. I apologize.
Yeah, you should copy and paste them.
Yeah, I should copy and paste these and send them to you. But then again, as an author, I don't like people violating copyright. So the reason I put this on the list, or suggested that James, as the producer, put this on the list, is the New York Times posted a pretty big article, and it's worth reading for really, if you want to learn about propaganda, it's worth reading, because it posts an opinion poll about what Americans think about various Supreme Court rulings. And now apparently, according to NPR, 80% of people in America are unhappy with Supreme Court rulings. Well, based upon what the New York Times and I don't know, Axios or somebody ran this survey, the way they were stated, they could create any kind of answer they wanted. They asked questions about recently folks will remember that a person didn't want to do a web design because they were, Christian and didn't believe in doing web design work for people who are homosexual, because their very narrowly defined Bible view of it was that was wrong. like libertarians would agree that you get to decide who you want to work for. You know, if you don't like if you don't want to do business for blue-eyed people, you don't have to have any customers who are blue-eyed. I mean, you know, that's freedom. But and they asked whether that was a good or bad thing. But the way they phrased the questions, and I wish I'd put it on flashcards to hold it up, but I didn't do that, was very interesting. And the one where people were most one-sided against the Supreme Court decision was based on something that I'm very familiar with as a fundraiser for a wonderful nonprofit or public interest law firm called Pacific Legal Foundation. The EPA has taken over, through its interpretation of waters of the United States and the rules it's written, the world. Basically, any time you want to do anything, they can, through their sleight of hand and interpretation of waters of the United States, prove that they have control over your land and tell you to stop doing something, to fine you. They threw a 80-year-old guy in prison for digging some firefighting ponds. But the way the question said, see if I can be very clear about it, and I'm sorry it took me a while to get to the point, was they asked people, should the waters of the United States be broadly interpreted to where not just navigable waters are protected from pollution, but things like wetlands? Or should it be narrowly defined, where waters of the United States or navigable waters should be the only ones that are protected from pollutants? And of course, 70% of people are going to say, well, pollutants, I mean, those are horrible things, right? 70% of people said, no, everything should be protected from pollutants. But that's not what the EPA was doing. They were defining pollutants as dirt. They were defining waters of the United States as a ditch. And so if something from your farm fell into the ditch, like dirt in one case, and wafted away, if they didn't like you, could throw you in jail and fine you $80,000 a day. They could decide that you couldn't build your house on a place where there are other houses around you that have been built 15 years ago because at one time it was a wetland, or because it drained into a wetland, yet you had neighbors all around you that their house was okay. Just on and on and on, ludicrous stuff. And then the cost of environmental regulation in this country, and most of it has to do with the water, you know, because that's the way it is $1 trillion a year at minimum. And we, as a country, can't afford to have a bunch of unelected bureaucrats who, up until some recent Supreme Court cases, were judge, jury, and executioner whenever there's a ruling. You couldn't even go to court and question the rulings. You just had to pay the fine.
And here's the thing, John. Congress could always give them the power to do that if they so chose.
Yeah.
They didn't say Congress couldn't. They said the bureaucracy couldn't make this decision on their own. Congress still can. And so if this stuff is that important, well, then get it pass an actual bill, actual law through Congress like you're supposed to.
What the Supreme Court actually did was make the people in the EPA toe the line and do what Congress actually set out and asked them to do. But they had expanded their power over the United States of America to basically where they could control every single drop of rain that fell from the sky or ran across the land. Yeah. And they could call anything they wanted to a wetland, and they could, through a convoluted mechanism, decide that everything eventually drained into water of the United States, therefore they could control it. And it's made farming and factories and housing and construction projects crazy expensive and lasting for years, especially in the West.
We're going to have to move on because otherwise we're not going to get to our climate change thing on China. And, well, John's talked enough, but we're going to hear you some more, John, because climate change and John Kerry. It said John Kerry went to China and asked China to speed up their climate change, their climate change work, and they essentially laughed at him and said, no.
We're not going to do that.
We're actually going to build 100 more coal plants, and we're going to continue to pollute more than anybody else in the world is.
Yeah.
So we can do all we want, and which is fine. I have no problems. I have no problems figuring out how to live cleaner. I'm all for it.
Let's define clean logically.
Let's not be very careful, because we're now finding out that all these EVs are now putting rubber pollutants into the air, and they are into the air, into the water, and they're ruining our roads because they're heavier.
And the batteries, you know, if getting rid of those batteries, folks, can be very, very, very expensive, and it's a zero-sum game. Battery-powered cars basically, you know, just transition until we get, you know, hydrogen fuel cell, you know, some better means, because batteries, there are physical limitations to how effective batteries can be. You can't even charge out battery packs in a Tesla because it weighs 1,100 pounds. You can pull it in a service station. I was thinking an easy way to do it is just change out the battery pack. It's 1,100 pounds. How are you going to do that?
And they're dangerous. Those batteries are literally dangerous.
Well, there's a ship, it might still be burning on the bottom of the ocean, that caught fire transporting a bunch of these vehicles across the Pacific or Atlantic, probably Pacific. And they couldn't put it out. They couldn't put the fire out.
No, there was a fire.
Literally couldn't put it out, fire out. And if people can't put a fire out on ships, because firefighting on ships is where all the firefighting technology all over the world came to science, because you don't even want to catch on fire on a ship. But China produces, I think, more greenhouse gas, greenhouse whatever it is, than all the rest of the countries in the world combined, including the U.S. Yes, if you use the Greens analysis, the United States has produced more up to this date, but all of that stuff has basically already cycled through. I mean, it's gone through the lungs of the earth. Some of it's still around, but the Chinese are producing gigatons of this stuff, and they're not going to stop until their standard of living for their people is the equivalent of ours. And they've said they're not going to stop, they're not going to do it. Yet somehow this is okay, and people in California aren't going to be able to use a gas-powered leaf blower, but people in China can throw up new coal-fired power plants. And so and the people that get most affected by this, again, are poor people. And I'm done with my rant.
It always comes down
back to the poor people.
It's always, you know, all these regulations that add costs. We've said it before, and we'll say it again many times. The end consumer pays all costs. And who's the end consumer? It's the person who can't pass those costs on. We've got about 30 seconds left, John, so I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank the team in there for doing a great job tonight. I want to thank you for watching. And please remember to love everybody, and good night.
Thank you.